What could possibly bring the richest woman in America to her knees on the worn wooden floor of a struggling single father's home? The answer had nothing to do with money, power, or success. It began with a quiet act of kindness that no headline ever reported, and it would forever change two lives that were never supposed to meet. Ethan Walker turned off the engine of his aging Ford F-150 as the last rays of the Kentucky sun painted the sky with shades of amber and soft blue. The old pickup ticked gently as it cooled, sounding almost as exhausted as the man climbing out of the driver's seat. 12 hours of repairing electrical systems across 3 small towns had left his shoulders aching and his hands rough from years of honest work. He reached for the paper grocery bag resting beside him. Inside were a loaf of fresh bread, a gallon of milk, and a small package of chocolate chip cookies because Friday evenings always deserved a little celebration, no matter how tight money had become. Ethan smiled quietly to himself as he walked toward the small white farmhouse where his 9-year-old daughter, Lily, was waiting. The porch steps creaked beneath his boots exactly as they always had. The lavender beside the walkway filled the evening air with its familiar fragrance. Everything looked ordinary until he noticed the front door standing slightly open. He stopped immediately. Ethan clearly remembered locking it before leaving at sunrise. His heartbeat slowed rather than raced. Years of raising Lily alone had taught him that panic never solved problems. He gently pushed the screen door open. Instead of silence, he heard the soft sound of humming drifting from the living room, followed by the rhythmic motion of a cloth moving across hardwood floors. There was also another scent floating through the house, fresh lemon polish mixed with homemade chicken soup simmering somewhere nearby. Neither belonged there that morning. Ethan quietly stepped inside and froze. A woman knelt on the living room floor with her sleeves rolled neatly above her elbows. Her expensive blonde hair had been gathered into a loose ponytail, and a simple blue sweater had replaced the elegant designer suits millions of Americans associated with her face. She carefully wiped away a tiny fingerprint from the coffee table before straightening a stack of Lily's schoolbooks with remarkable care. A bucket of warm water rested beside her, while freshly folded laundry sat neatly on the couch. She looked up as though she had been expecting him all along. A gentle smile appeared across her face, warm enough to erase every trace of awkwardness from the room. "You are home earlier than I expected," she said softly. Ethan stared in complete disbelief. He recognized her instantly. Every business magazine at the grocery store checkout carried her photograph. Every financial news program analyzed her decisions. Victoria, billionaire, founder and chief executive officer of Hayes Living, one of the most influential women in America. Yet here she stood inside his modest farmhouse, holding a cleaning cloth instead of standing behind a polished conference table. Ethan blinked once, convinced exhaustion had begun playing tricks on his mind. "Victoria," he finally whispered, barely recognizing his own voice. "How did you get into my house?" She gently placed the cloth into the bucket before answering. "Lily invited me in after school." Ethan turned toward the hallway, just as light footsteps echoed across the wooden floor. His daughter appeared with flour dusted across her cheeks, wearing a bright apron that had once belonged to her late mother. She ran into his arms with joyful laughter. "Daddy," she exclaimed, "Miss Victoria helped me bake cookies, fix the loose cabinet door, and she already knows my favorite bedtime story." Ethan looked back at Victoria, his confusion growing even deeper. He had never introduced them. He had never told anyone where he lived. Yet somehow the most powerful woman in America knew his daughter by name, knew the sound of laughter inside his home, and seemed to belong there far more naturally than anyone could possibly explain. The warmth inside the little farmhouse felt strangely untouched by the outside world. Fresh cookies cooled on a wire rack beside the kitchen window, while the comforting aroma of homemade chicken soup drifted gently through every room. Ethan quietly set the grocery bag on the counter without taking his eyes off Victoria. She did not look uncomfortable. She did not appear nervous about being discovered. Instead, she calmly picked up a folded dish towel and began drying the last plate as though she had spent years inside the familiar kitchen. Would you please sit down? She asked with a soft smile. Dinner is almost ready. Ethan let out a quiet breath that sounded somewhere between disbelief and reluctant amusement. Most people introduce themselves before making dinner in someone else's house. Victoria lowered her eyes for a moment before answering. That would have been the normal way. Lily climbed onto one of the old wooden chairs, swinging her legs happily beneath the table. Daddy, Miss Victoria makes grilled cheese almost exactly like Mom used to. Ethan's expression softened immediately. He glanced toward the cast-iron skillet resting on the stove before looking back at Victoria. How did you know that was Lily's favorite? Victoria smiled gently. I did not. She taught me. Lily laughed proudly. She burned the first sandwich. Victoria laughed with her. The second one was much better. The simple conversation somehow made everything even more mysterious. Nothing about Victoria resembled the polished executive Ethan had occasionally seen on television interviews. Her sleeves remained rolled above her elbows. A small streak of flour rested near her wrist. The expensive watch usually photographed beside world leaders was nowhere to be seen. She looked less like the head of a billion-dollar company and more like someone who had quietly stepped into a life she had always wanted but never believed she could have. Ethan slowly walked through the living room. The old bookshelf had been dusted. Lily's scattered coloring pencils were neatly organized inside a mason jar. The loose curtain rod he had planned to repair over the weekend had already been tightened. Even Rusty, the elderly golden retriever sleeping peacefully beside the fireplace, rested on a freshly washed blanket. None of the changes were expensive. None of them announced themselves. Every small detail simply whispered that someone had cared enough to notice. Ethan returned to the kitchen and leaned against the doorway. Lily said she invited you after school. Victoria nodded. She recognized me from the community literacy event last month. Ethan remembered volunteering that evening, but leaving early because of an emergency service call. Lily continued speaking before anyone else could. She asked where you were because you helped fix the lights before everyone came. Victoria looked toward Ethan with quiet admiration. Your daughter was very proud of you. Ethan shrugged modestly. Children usually think their parents can do more than they really can. Victoria gently shook her head. Sometimes they simply see what the rest of the world overlooks. Silence settled across the room, comfortable instead of awkward. Outside, the setting sun painted long golden lines across the hardwood floor, while the old wind chime on the porch sang softly in the evening breeze. Victoria placed 3 bowls of soup onto the table before pulling out a chair for Lily. She moved with surprising familiarity, never asking where anything belonged because she somehow already knew. Ethan noticed it immediately. This is not your first visit here, is it? Victoria paused with one hand resting lightly on the back of the chair. She looked toward Lily, then slowly back at Ethan. A gentle smile appeared across her face, carrying equal parts gratitude and quiet honesty. No, she admitted softly. Today was my 7th visit. You simply happened to come home early enough to finally meet me. Ethan did not speak for several long seconds. The old wall clock ticked softly above the kitchen doorway, while steam continued rising from the bowls of soup waiting untouched on the table. 7 visits. The words echoed through his mind far louder than they had been spoken. He looked at Lily, who smiled innocently as though nothing unusual had happened. To her, Victoria had simply become another kind adult who listened carefully, laughed often, and never seemed too busy to spend time together. Ethan finally pulled out a chair and sat down across from Victoria. You came here 7 times, he said, calmly. Why? Victoria wrapped both hands around her bowl, drawing a slow breath before answering. Because I wanted to understand whether the man I met that afternoon was real or whether I had imagined him. Ethan frowned slightly. The sentence awakened a memory that had quietly rested in the back of his mind for months. Then, heavy gray clouds. A lonely stretch of highway outside Millbrook. A black luxury sedan parked beside the road with its hazard lights flashing against the wet pavement. Flashbacks returned one quiet moment at a time. Ethan had just finished repairing the electrical system inside a small country church when the storm rolled across the hills. On his drive home, he noticed the stranded vehicle. Many drivers continued past without slowing down. Ethan had simply pulled onto the shoulder because someone needed help. He remembered grabbing his toolbox before jogging through the rain. The woman standing beside the car had held a broken umbrella that barely protected her from wind. Her hair clung to her face, and frustration filled her eyes, but she had thanked him before he even opened the hood. It took less than 20 minutes to discover that a battery cable had shaken loose after hitting a deep pothole. Ethan tightened the connection, checked the electrical system, and closed the hood with a satisfied smile. When the engine started again, the woman reached in her handbag and offered him several crisp $100 bills. Ethan had laughed quietly and stepped back. "Keep your money," he had said. "Use it to buy yourself a hot dinner once you get home. Everybody deserves one after a day like this." Victoria looked into Ethan's eyes across the kitchen table. "Do you remember what happened next?" she asked softly. Ethan nodded. "You asked why I would help someone for free." Victoria smiled with gentle sadness. "And do you remember your answer?" Ethan thought for another moment before the words returned. "Because if my wife or my daughter were ever stranded on the side of the road, I would pray that someone stopped for them too." The kitchen became completely quiet. Even Lily stopped eating as she listened carefully. Victoria lowered her eyes for a moment before continuing. "You have no idea how many people know my face, Ethan. Every week someone wants an investment, a donation, a photograph, or an introduction. But that afternoon you looked at me and saw only another human being standing alone in the rain." She smiled through grateful eyes. "That had not happened to me in a very long time." Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I only did what anyone should have done." Victoria slowly shook her head. "No, you did what good people choose to do when nobody is watching." Lily reached across the table and quietly placed one small hand over Victoria's. "Daddy always says kindness is the only thing you never lose by giving away." Victoria looked toward the little girl with a smile that seemed brighter than any award she had ever received. Then she turned back to Ethan. "After that day, I asked my assistant to find an electrician who refused my money. I expected to thank him once." She paused as warm evening light filled the kitchen windows. "Instead, every visit here reminded me that I was not searching for the man who fixed my car. I was searching for the peaceful life that quietly existed inside this little farmhouse all along." That night, after Lily had fallen asleep with her favorite storybook resting across her blanket, the farmhouse settled into the peaceful silence that only the countryside seemed able to offer. Outside, the porch light cast a warm circle across the weathered wooden steps, while distant crickets filled the cool Kentucky evening with their familiar song. Ethan carried 2 steaming mugs of coffee onto the porch and quietly handed one to Victoria. She accepted it with a grateful smile before sitting on the old porch swing that gently creaked beneath its own history. Neither of them hurried to speak. Some conversations needed room to breathe. Ethan looked across the open fields where rows of corn disappeared beneath the moonlight. "You said you came here 7 times, he finally said. "What happened during those visits?" Victoria wrapped both hands around the warm mug before answering. "Mostly ordinary things." She smiled softly. "The kind of ordinary things I realized I have been missing for years." Ethan listened quietly as she described those afternoons. She had helped Lily finish homework at the kitchen table while learning multiplication songs she had forgotten decades earlier. She had baked cookies that came out slightly overdone because Lily insisted every cookie looked happier with extra chocolate chips. She had repaired a squeaky cabinet after watching a simple instructional video because she wanted to solve at least one problem without asking an assistant. She had watered the tiny vegetable garden behind the house and laughed when tomatoes refused to grow perfectly straight. She had even sat on the porch during a summer rainstorm, simply listening to drops fall across the old tin roof. None of those moments appeared in financial newspapers. None increased the value of her company. Yet somehow they had become the most valuable hours of her entire year. Ethan smiled faintly. Lily has a way of convincing people to slow down. Victoria laughed quietly. She does not even realize she is doing it. Her expression gradually became thoughtful. "The first time I came here, I intended to leave after 30 minutes. Then Lily asked if I would stay long enough to help her paint a birdhouse. She looked toward the backyard where the colorful little birdhouse now hung beneath an old oak tree. The second visit lasted 2 hours. The third lasted all afternoon. By the seventh visit, I realized I had stopped checking my phone every 5 minutes. Ethan glanced at her with genuine curiosity. No one from your company wondered where you were. Victoria smiled knowingly. They believed I was attending leadership retreats. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Were you? She looked around the quiet farmhouse, the porch swing, the wind chimes moving gently in the evening breeze, and the soft light glowing through Lily's bedroom window. In a way, she answered. I learned more about leadership sitting at your kitchen table than I did during the last 5 corporate conferences I attended. Ethan laughed softly before shaking his head. I have never led anything except electrical crews and one stubborn little girl. Victoria looked directly into his eyes. You lead every single day. She spoke with calm certainty. You lead by showing up before sunrise. You lead by keeping promises even when nobody applauds. You lead by choosing patience when life would excuse frustration. Most importantly, you lead by making one little girl believe that the world is still a safe place after losing her mother. Ethan lowered his eyes toward the steaming coffee in his hands. Compliments had always made him uncomfortable. I'm just trying to be the father she deserves. Victoria's voice softened until it almost blended with the evening breeze. That is exactly why I kept coming back. I have spent years surrounded by people trying to become successful. Then I met a man who had quietly become meaningful without ever trying. Those are not the same thing. As silence returned once more, Ethan noticed something resting beside Victoria's chair. It was Lily's small memory box, the one she never allowed anyone else to open. Victoria gently lifted it on her lap, but did not remove the lid. She simply smiled toward the upstairs window and whispered, almost to herself, "She trusted me enough to leave this here. I think that may be the greatest honor I have ever received." The following morning began the same way it always did for Ethan, with the quiet hum of the coffee maker before sunrise and the familiar sound of old floorboards beneath his boots. The sky outside still carried soft shades of gray as he packed Lily's lunch, checked the weather for the day's electrical jobs, and searched for his worn leather tool belt. When he reached for it, he stopped. Every screwdriver had already been cleaned. Every pair of pliers had been carefully arranged by size. Even the frayed extension cord he had planned to replace had been wrapped neatly with a handwritten note attached. The note simply read, "The wire insulation is wearing thin. Please replace this before next week. Someone needs you to come home safely every evening." Ethan quietly smiled before folding the note and placing it inside his shirt pocket. He looked toward the kitchen where Victoria stood preparing scrambled eggs while humming softly to herself. She glanced over her shoulder and immediately recognized the expression on his face. "I hope you do not mind," she said gently. "I noticed the cord yesterday." Ethan shook his head. "Most people notice the house. You notice the toolbox." Victoria poured fresh coffee into his favorite mug. "Because the toolbox is what brings you home every day." Her answer lingered in the room long after she returned to the stove. Lily came downstairs moments later with sleepy eyes and untidy hair, wrapping both arms around Ethan before climbing onto her chair. Breakfast unfolded with the comforting rhythm of an ordinary family morning. They laughed when Lily accidentally spilled orange juice across the table. Victoria reached for a towel before Ethan even stood up, and together they cleaned the small mess while Lily apologized between quiet giggles. It felt natural, almost familiar. Ethan caught himself wondering how someone whose calendar was probably scheduled months in advance could fit so effortlessly into a life built around simple routines and ordinary moments. After breakfast, Ethan loaded his tools into the pickup truck. Victoria walked outside with him while Lily waited near the porch waving goodbye. The morning air carried the scent of fresh grass and dew resting across the fields. "You do not have to stay while I am gone," Ethan said. "I know your world is waiting." Victoria looked across the quiet property before answering. "For years I believed that world could not function without me. She smiled thoughtfully. Yesterday, I turned my phone on for the first time in 3 days. Do you know how many emergencies had already solved themselves? Ethan laughed softly. That sounds like life. She nodded. Exactly. I spent so many years believing I had to control everything that I forgot how to simply live. Ethan rested one hand on the truck door. Lily enjoys having you here. Victoria looked toward the little girl chasing butterflies near the mailbox. I enjoy being here too. There was no hesitation in her voice, only quiet honesty. Before Ethan climbed into the truck, Victoria reached into the pocket of her sweater and handed him a small paper envelope. Please open it after work, she said. Ethan accepted it without looking inside. Should I be worried? Victoria smiled warmly. Not at all. It is not money. Ethan nodded, trusting her without asking another question. As he drove away along the narrow country road, he glanced once in the rearview mirror. Victoria stood beside Lily in the golden morning light, waving until the truck disappeared beyond the hills. Hours later, during his lunch break beneath the shade of an old oak tree beside a church he was repairing, Ethan finally remembered the envelope. Inside, he found a folded piece of notebook paper written in careful handwriting. There was only one sentence. Thank you for showing me that a meaningful life is built one ordinary day at a time. Ethan quietly folded the note again and slipped it beside the one she had left on his toolbox. For reasons he could not explain, those two simple pieces of paper suddenly felt more valuable than anything money had ever been able to buy. The afternoon sun drifted slowly across the Kentucky countryside, while Ethan finished replacing the final electrical panel inside the small community church. As he packed his tools into the back of the pickup truck, his phone vibrated several times in rapid succession. He rarely received more than 1 or 2 calls during the workday, so the unfamiliar number repeating across the screen caught his attention. When he answered, the voice on the other end sounded unusually nervous. It belonged to his longtime friend, Caleb Morgan, who owned the hardware store in town. Ethan, Caleb said quietly, I think you should come home when you can. Ethan immediately straightened. Is Lily all right? She is fine, Caleb replied quickly. But your driveway is full of expensive black sport utility vehicles. I have never seen anything like it. Ethan thanked him, ended the call, and looked toward the western sky where dark clouds had begun gathering beyond the hills. During the drive home, he could not stop thinking about Victoria. She had promised the envelope contained nothing complicated. Yet something inside him whispered that peaceful moments rarely remained hidden forever. 20 minutes later, his old pickup turned onto the familiar gravel road leading to the farmhouse. Caleb had not exaggerated. Nearly a dozen luxury vehicles stood parked neatly beside the fence, their polished black paint reflecting the afternoon sunlight. Men and women dressed in tailored business suits stood quietly near the porch, speaking in low voices, while several others checked phones that never seemed to stop ringing. The peaceful farmhouse suddenly looked surrounded by another world entirely. Ethan parked beside the barn and climbed out without rushing. Years of difficult days had taught him that calm decisions almost always began with calm footsteps. Before he reached the porch, the front door opened. Victoria stepped outside wearing the same simple blue sweater she had worn while baking cookies with Lily. There was no sign of the powerful executive the business world expected to see. She simply smiled with quiet relief when she noticed Ethan walking toward the house. I hope you will be home soon, she said gently. Ethan glanced toward the unfamiliar visitors before looking back at her. Friend of yours? Victoria gave a small, knowing smile. Something like that. At that moment, a distinguished man with silver hair and an impeccably tailored navy suit walked forward from the group. He carried a leather portfolio beneath one arm, but his expression held more concern than authority. Miss Hayes, he said respectfully, everyone has been searching for you. Victoria nodded politely, but did not move from Ethan's side. The man continued, the board has postponed meetings across 3 countries. Reporters are waiting outside headquarters. Investors are demanding answers. They believe something terrible has happened. Ethan quietly looked at Victoria. She remained perfectly calm. Nothing terrible has happened, she replied. For the first time in years, something wonderful has happened." Several executives exchanged uncertain glances. None of them seemed prepared for that answer. The silver-haired man sighed gently. "The company cannot function without you." Victoria slowly turned toward the farmhouse where laughter drifted through an open window. Lily and Rusty were chasing one another across the living room while the scent of fresh apple pie floated into the afternoon air. Victoria smiled before speaking again. "That is exactly what I used to believe." She looked back at the waiting executives with peaceful confidence. "Then I spent 7 afternoons inside this little house and discovered something my boardroom never taught me." The entire driveway became completely silent. Even the breeze seemed to pause among the maple trees as everyone waited to hear the words that would explain why the most powerful woman in their world had chosen, of all places, a struggling father's modest farmhouse instead of the towering offices she had built. The silence lingered for several heartbeats before Victoria slowly stepped away from the porch and faced the gathering of executives with the same calm confidence that had once commanded international boardrooms. Yet there was something different about her now. The sharp edges of constant pressure had softened into quiet certainty. She folded her hands in front of her and looked at each familiar face one by one. "Do you remember the last question any of you asked me before I left Chicago?" she said gently. The silver-haired chief financial officer lowered his eyes as he searched his memory. No one answered. Victoria smiled sadly. "Neither do I." A gentle breeze stirred the maple leaves above the driveway, while the scent of fresh apple pie drifted from the kitchen window. She continued, "Do you know why? Because every conversation was about profits, deadlines, acquisitions, market value, or expansion. Not one person asked whether I had slept well. Not one person wondered whether I was happy." The executives exchanged uncomfortable glances. Ethan remained quietly beside the porch steps, saying nothing. He understood this was not his conversation. It was hers. Victoria turned toward him for only a moment before speaking again. 6 months ago, my car stopped on a lonely highway during a rainstorm. Hundreds of people passed by. One man stopped. She looked back toward the executives. He never asked for my name. He never recognized my face. He never cared about my company. He simply saw another human being who needed help. The chief financial officer nodded respectfully. "We know he repaired your vehicle." Victoria gently shook her head. "No, he repaired something much more important." Every eye remained fixed on her. That afternoon reminded me of the person I used to be before success became my identity. She smiled warmly toward Ethan. When I offered him money, he refused. He told me to buy myself a warm dinner because everybody deserved kindness after a difficult day. Ethan looked slightly embarrassed as several executives turned toward him with quiet admiration. Victoria continued, "After my assistant found his address, I planned to visit once, thank him properly, and leave. Instead, I found a little girl who still believed bedtime stories mattered. I found a father who never complained, even when life gave him every reason to. I found a kitchen where conversations were more valuable than negotiations. I found laughter that did not depend on stock prices." Lily quietly stepped onto the porch beside her father, holding Rusty's collar while listening carefully. Victoria smiled at the little girl before continuing. "Every afternoon I spent here reminded me that I had built beautiful offices but forgotten how to build a meaningful life." The chief financial officer took one slow step forward. "Miss Hayes, are you saying this family changed your priorities?" Victoria answered without hesitation. "No." She looked around the peaceful farmhouse, the vegetable garden, the porch swing, and the old pickup truck resting beside the barn. "They reminded me of the priorities I abandoned years ago." Another long silence settled over the driveway. Even the executives who usually measured every minute with expensive watches seemed unwilling to interrupt it. Finally, Victoria took a slow breath and spoke the words that none of them expected to hear. "I am not walking away from Hayes Living. I am walking back toward the reason I created it in the first place." She glanced toward the farmhouse one final time before facing the board. "We promised families stronger homes. Somewhere along the way, we became obsessed with stronger numbers instead. This family reminded me that a house only becomes a Home when kindness lives inside it. No one argued. No one rushed to object. The silver-haired chief financial officer quietly closed his leather portfolio without removing a single document. For the first time in many years, the people who managed one of America's largest companies stood in complete silence before a modest farmhouse, realizing that the most valuable lesson they had ever witnessed had not come from a conference room, but from an ordinary father whose greatest achievement had never appeared on a financial statement. The following morning dawned beneath a clear blue Kentucky sky, but the quiet farmhouse welcomed guests unlike any it had ever seen before. One by one, the same black sport utility vehicles returned along the gravel driveway, though this time they arrived without urgency. The executives stepped out carrying notebooks instead of demands. Expensive shoes carefully crossed the uneven ground while the scent of fresh biscuits drifted through the open kitchen window. Ethan greeted each visitor with a warm handshake before inviting them inside. There was no conference hall waiting for them, no polished marble floor, no enormous screen displaying quarterly reports. Only an old oak dining table surrounded by mismatched wooden chairs polished by decades of family meals. Lily happily placed homemade blueberry muffins onto colorful ceramic plates, while Rusty wandered between the guests, hoping someone might quietly share a small piece of breakfast. The unusual setting slowly softened every face in the room. Conversation became quieter. Phones disappeared into briefcases. For the first time in years, these executives began a meeting by thanking the person who had prepared the coffee instead of checking market updates. Victoria stood beside the dining room window as warm sunlight poured across the hardwood floor. She looked around the table before speaking with calm conviction. For many years, I believed leadership meant staying one step ahead of everyone else. I worked longer hours, attended more meetings, and chased larger numbers because I thought success demanded constant sacrifice. She paused and smiled toward Ethan, who quietly remained near the doorway with folded arms. Then I discovered something this family practices every single day without calling it leadership at all. The room became completely still. Real leadership begins by noticing people before noticing performance. It begins by protecting families before protecting profits. It begins by asking how someone is doing before asking what they accomplished. Several board members slowly lowered their pens, no longer taking notes because the words seemed too personal for ordinary minutes. Victoria continued, "Beginning today, Hayes Living will create a new foundation dedicated to helping working parents repair unsafe homes, assisting widowed families with emergency housing improvements, and supporting local communities through volunteer partnerships instead of advertising campaigns." A quiet murmur spread around the table. The chief financial officer looked thoughtful rather than concerned. "That will require a significant investment," he said carefully. Victoria nodded without hesitation. "So did every building we ever constructed. The difference is that this investment will strengthen people before it strengthens balance sheets." Ethan remained silent, but his eyes reflected quiet respect. He had never imagined that one rainy afternoon on the side of a highway could eventually reshape one of America's largest companies. Lily looked from one adult to another before raising her small hand as though she were sitting in school. Everyone smiled. "Can I say something?" she asked. "Victoria nadie guardi." Lily looked around the table with complete innocence. "Daddy says people remember how you make them feel much longer than they remember what you give them." Silence followed once again, but this time it felt lighter. One by one, the executives smiled. Some quietly wiped away tears they had not expected to feel during a business meeting. The chief financial officer slowly closed his notebook and looked directly at Victoria. "Miss Hayes," he said softly, "perhaps this is the most important strategy session our company has ever held." Victoria glanced toward the little farmhouse kitchen where laughter, fresh bread, and ordinary life had quietly rewritten her understanding of success. She realized that no skyscraper she had ever built could compare to a place where people naturally gathered around one table, listened with open hearts, and left carrying something far more valuable than business plans. In that simple room, surrounded by humble walls and honest people, everyone present understood that the strongest foundations were never poured from concrete alone. They were built from kindness, trust, and the quiet courage to place people before power. 1 year later, the little white farmhouse looked much the same from the outside, yet everything inside carried the quiet evidence of lives gently transformed by kindness. The porch had a fresh coat of paint. Bright flowers bloomed beneath the windows. The vegetable garden stretched farther than before, overflowing with tomatoes, peppers, and sunflowers that Lily insisted brought good luck to everyone who visited. On a peaceful Saturday morning, the familiar sound of Ethan's hammer echoed softly as he repaired a section of the old wooden fence, while birds welcomed another beautiful Kentucky sunrise. He still drove the same faithful pickup truck. He still wore the same worn work boots. He still believed that honest work and quiet promises mattered more than recognition. Some things were never meant to change. Inside the farmhouse, the comforting aroma of fresh cinnamon rolls drifted from the kitchen. Victoria stood at the counter wearing a simple apron dusted with flour, smiling as she carefully followed one of Sarah's handwritten family recipes that Lily had proudly shared months earlier. She had returned to leading Hayes living, but she no longer allowed the company to consume the life she had finally learned to value. Every Friday afternoon, she left the office early, drove the familiar country roads, and returned to the place where no one cared about stock prices or magazine covers. The foundation she had created for working families had repaired thousands of homes across America, but she quietly admitted that the first home it truly restored had been her own heart. Lily hurried through the back door, carrying a basket filled with fresh vegetables from the garden. "Dad," she called happily, "Miss Victoria says the cinnamon rolls are finally perfect." Ethan laughed while setting down his hammer. "That means I only have one job left." Lily tilted her head curiously. "What job is that?" Ethan smiled as he looked toward the kitchen window, where Victoria was laughing to herself after getting a little flour on her nose. "Enjoy breakfast with the two people who make this house feel alive." A few hours later, the town gathered for its annual community harvest celebration. Families filled the park with picnic blankets, homemade pies, music, and children's games beneath rows of colorful banners fluttering in the autumn breeze. The mayor stepped onto the small wooden stage and welcomed everyone before announcing a special recognition for the new community housing initiative that had quietly helped hundreds of local families during the past year. He invited Victoria to the stage, but before she reached the microphone, she gently shook her head and looked toward Ethan. "This does not belong to me alone," she said. "It began because one father stopped beside a lonely road without asking who I was." The crowd turned toward Ethan, who stood awkwardly near the back holding 2 paper cups of lemonade. He smiled modestly and quietly shook his head, hoping someone else would accept the attention instead. Lily laughed, ran to his side, and took one of his hands before reaching for Victoria's with the other. Standing between them beneath the warm golden afternoon sun, she looked up with complete innocence and said the words that filled every heart with quiet joy. "Families are the people who keep showing up, even when they do not have to." Victoria gently brushed a tear from her cheek before embracing Lily with grateful tenderness. Ethan wrapped one steady arm around both of them, and for a long moment no one spoke. They did not need to. Sometimes the strongest endings arrive without applause, carried only by peaceful silence and grateful hearts. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the rolling Kentucky hills, laughter echoed across the fields, children chased one another beneath the glowing sky, and the old farmhouse welcomed. Another evening filled with warmth. In the end, the greatest miracle had never been that a billionaire walked into a struggling father's home. The true miracle was that kindness quietly opened a door, humility chose to walk through it, and 3 ordinary hearts discovered that the richest life is the one built together, one simple day at a time.